The assignment came through on a Tuesday, which is how I know the Bureau of Interstellar Affairs was not taking it seriously. Serious assignments arrive on Mondays, when the undersecretary is in the building and the budget office hasn't yet been sufficiently worn down to sign anything. Serious assignments come with a full briefing packet, a per diem authorization that doesn't make you laugh, and a travel allowance that covers more than one checked bag. Serious assignments do not come with the phrase, logistical constraints may apply in the third paragraph, which is bureaucratic shorthand for, we're sorry about the accommodations. We don't know exactly when you're coming home, and please try not to escalate anything. This one had all three. My name is Adeze Obi. I am 68 years old. I spent 31 years as a Foreign Service interpreter and cultural liaison before my knees and my patients reached a negotiated settlement, and I retired to a small house in Abuja with a vegetable garden and a cat. The Bureau knows my contact information because I was once the best Sorvath cluster linguist in active service, and because I had the misfortune of remaining competent past retirement. They call me when someone needs a translation that can't be done by committee, and I go because the pension isn't quite what the brochures implied, and because, if I am being honest, the garden has a sluggoth problem that the cat is doing nothing to address. The cat is Miso. Miso is a Maine Coon 7 years old and 12.5 kilograms at his last veterinary visit, which the vet annotated with the word substantial and a small drawing that might have been a cloud or might have been a cartoon rendering of the scale readout. He is the color of a winter storm, gray and cream and smoke, with a tail like a particularly opinionated feather duster, and he has the slow, regal bearing of a creature who has considered the available options and concluded that most of them are beneath him. He does not hurry. He does not startle. He has never, in 7 years, made a sound that could be described as alarmed. He has been with me to 7 postings. He holds a valid interstellar transit certificate, a veterinary health clearance, and a biometric identity record in the Bureau's dependents and accompanying personnel database. Because someone in facilities once pointed out that accompanying personnel had never been defined to exclude cats, and the legal department had not, in 36 months of periodic inquiry, been able to demonstrate otherwise. Miso has, as a result, an official Bureau ID number. He does not appear to be aware of this honor. I booked his carrier as carry-on. He spent the 3-day transit to Station Karev Null sitting in the carrier with the mesh panel open, looking at the other passengers with the measured clinical interest of a scholar reviewing primary sources. 2 of the other passengers, both junior diplomatic aides, both on their first interstellar posting, moved to different seats within the first hour. He did not appear to notice. The 3rd passenger to change seats was a Kethari commercial attaché who had been on the same transit, I later learned, as part of a separate delegation to the station. He moved not because Miso frightened him, but because, as he mentioned to Commander Omandi several days later, he had found the cat's level of sustained attention epistemologically disconcerting. He could not explain what he meant by this. He was not wrong. Miso had been traveling with me since he was 14 weeks old. The carrier is not a source of stress for him. It is, from everything I can observe, simply another room that moves. He settles into it with the same unhurried equanimity with which he settles into everything. He does not pace. He does not vocalize except in the specific informational way he vocalizes when he wants something concrete, like water or a door opened. He watches. He thinks, if cats think in the sense we mean when we use the word, or does whatever the functional equivalent of thinking is for a creature that experiences the world primarily through patience and sustained attention. My late husband used to say that Miso was the most present being he had ever encountered. He meant it as a compliment and as an observation. Kofi was a doctor, a quiet, methodical man who noticed things about the way organisms occupied space, and he had a theory about Miso that I have never been able to disprove. His theory was that Miso was not calm because nothing worried him. His theory was that Miso was calm because he had never once, in his entire life, conflated his own presence with the question of whether that presence was welcome. He was simply there. The room's opinion about whether he belonged there was not information he had ever requested. Kofi died 4 years ago. Miso slept on his side of the bed for 3 months. Not performing grief. Cats don't perform things. Just choosing the warmest, most familiar smelling space available, which happened also to be the space that hurt to look at. I did not redecorate. I mention this not because it is relevant to the Sorvath Treaty negotiation, which it is not, but because if I am explaining who Miso is, I should explain that too. He is not a diplomatic instrument. He is not a strategy. He is a cat who has been with me through a retirement and a bereavement and a sluggoth-infested vegetable garden, and who still, at 7 years old, considers himself the appropriate occupant of every room he enters. That is all he is. That is also, apparently, enough. Station Karev Null is not a beautiful station. It was built 30 years ago as a joint logistics hub and has been expanded 4 times since in ways that suggest the architects were working from different sets of plans. The central hub is broad and low-ceilinged, with the particular quality of artificial light that makes everyone look like they haven't slept, and the corridors are color-coded in a scheme that made sense when there were fewer of them. The diplomatic wing was added in the second expansion, and is marginally nicer than the rest of the station, in the way that a slightly better carpet is nicer. You notice it, but it doesn't change the fundamental nature of the room. Commander Vesa Omandi met me at the docking collar. She is 52, short, with the careful posture of someone who has spent years learning to seem taller in rooms where height is read as authority. She commands the station with what I understand to be significant competence and what I observed to be significant anxiety on this particular occasion. "Dr. Obi," she said, shaking my hand. She glanced at the carrier. "And this is the Misos," I said. "He's on file." Yes. She had clearly reviewed the file. She had clearly not expected the file to be accurate. The Sorvath Delegation arrives in 11 hours. The session opens at 0700 local. We have a 14-hour window before their lead delegate's operational clock expires, and they withdraw to their ship. "I know," I said. "I read the briefing, the 3 contested amendments. I know about those too." She looked at me. She looked at the carrier. Miso, from within it, looked back at her with the unhurried attention of a creature who finds all things equally interesting and equally beneath comment. "Is he going to be a problem?" she asked. "He has never been a problem," I said, which is technically accurate in all the ways that matter and imprecise in some ways that don't. She nodded, once, in the way that people nod when they have decided to file a concern rather than voice it, and led me to the diplomatic wing. The consultation room assigned to me was the one they give to senior advisors, which is to say, it had a window that looked out onto the station's exterior hull rather than into another corridor, and a desk that had been chosen for its appearance of authority rather than its ergonomic properties. There was a coffee station on the side table. There were 4 chairs around the main conference table, 2 of which were not bolted to the floor. I unpacked in 20 minutes. Miso emerged from the carrier at his own pace, conducted a thorough inspection of the room's perimeter, determined that the desk chair was the most suitable surface available, and sat on it. I let him sit. He does this. He has always done this. He identifies the highest status object in any room, the best chair, the most important-looking surface, the place where a person of authority would sit, and occupies it with the calm assurance of someone exercising a right. In 31 years of postings in 7 countries and 4 space stations and 2 orbital habitats, I have never successfully trained him out of it. I have stopped trying. What he does on his own time is his business. I spent the evening reviewing my notes on Sorvath social linguistics. They are a complex case. The Sorvath are a hierarchical species, not unusually so by the standards of the Vorath cluster, but hierarchical in a specific way that makes them difficult for human diplomats who haven't studied them carefully. Their social structure is signal-based. Status is communicated almost entirely through behavioral cues: posture, response latency, attention direction, and what their linguists call the yield index, the degree to which a given individual will modify their behavior in the presence of another. High-status individuals do not yield. Low-status individuals yield constantly, preemptively, sometimes before the higher-status individual has done anything to prompt it. The system works well within their own species. The problem, in multi-species contexts, is that the Sorvath read yield behavior from everyone. They cannot turn it off. Their neural architecture processes status signals automatically, the way a human processes facial expressions, not as a deliberate choice, but as an involuntary perceptual event. When they encounter a species that doesn't yield in the expected ways, their social processing generates an output that their diplomats have described, in the Bureau's translated reports, as significant discomfort and interpretive difficulty. What this means in practice is that Sorvath delegations respond poorly to humans who appear too eager to please. The more conciliatory a human diplomat is, the lower the Sorvath read their status, and the harder the Sorvath push on contested points, not out of bad faith, but because their instinct-level social processing is telling them they've identified a lower-ranked individual and should extract maximum concessions before the hierarchy resets. It's not malice. It is, as I wrote in my 2041 advisory to the Bureau, a very straightforward system that produces very straightforward outcomes once you understand it. The 3 contested amendments in the current treaty framework were, in my professional assessment, not actually contested on substantive grounds. The Sorvath-led delegate, Councillor Vorath, whom I had read extensively and met once briefly at a cluster summit 8 years ago, was not strategically committed to those amendments. They were positional holds. They were the behavioral expression of a high-status individual who had read the Bureau's negotiating team as lower-ranked and was therefore waiting for them to yield. The Bureau's negotiating team had been yielding for 6 weeks. I made tea. I reviewed Vorath's published position statements. I went to bed at 2200. I should tell you something about how I came to know the Sorvath as well as I do, because it is relevant context, and because the Bureau's briefing packets never include it. I first encountered the Sorvath Yield Index as a practical problem in 2038, during a commercial corridor summit that predated my promotion to senior liaison, and that I attended as a junior interpreter for a senior diplomat named Arnav Mehta, who was brilliant, decisive, and completely wrong about Sorvath psychology in a specific way that cost the Bureau 6 months of renegotiation. Mehta was the kind of diplomat who believed that goodwill was the most reliable foundation for any agreement, and he was not wrong about that as a general principle. He was wrong about it in the specific context of a species whose social processing architecture cannot receive goodwill signals clearly when they are layered on top of accommodating behavior. He smiled a great deal. He deferred graciously on small points to demonstrate flexibility. He opened sessions with warm, collegial Sorvath greetings in the medium formal register, which communicates in their grammar, something like, "I consider us to be of roughly comparable standing, and I look forward to our discussion as equals." The Sorvath delegation read all of this as a significant yield index score, recalibrated him as lower status than any of them, and pushed hard on every clause they thought they could extract concessions from. They weren't acting in bad faith. They were responding to the social inputs they were receiving. Mehta's warmth and flexibility, which would have been assets in a human-to-human negotiation, were being processed by the Sorvath as signals of a lower-ranked individual trying to establish rapport. The more collegial he was, the harder they pushed. I was 29 years old and had been studying Sorvath social linguistics for 2 years. I watched this happen for 4 days and wrote an 8-page note at the end of each session that I was too junior to deliver in any useful form. On the 5th day, Mehta asked me, slightly desperately, why the delegation kept expanding their demands when he kept demonstrating goodwill. I told him. He didn't believe me. Then we ran a small experiment. I suggested he spend one session delivering his points in the high formal register without the collegial framing and without making any accommodating gestures on the small points. Not aggressively, just without accommodation. Just the points delivered as settled determinations rather than opening positions. The Sorvath-led delegate, in that session, withdrew 2 contested clauses without prompting. Meta looked at me across the table afterward with the expression of a man whose professional model of human nature has just been updated in an uncomfortable direction. They respond to how certain you are, he said. Not what you say. Not just certainty, I said. The absence of yield signals. They read accommodation as an invitation to push. They read stillness as something they don't push against. And you've known this for 2 years. I've been trying to find a good moment to mention it. He wrote a very generous note about my analytical work in the session debrief. I was promoted twice in the following 4 years, and when I was finally running my own sessions, I structured my entire approach around what I had understood in that room. That the most powerful thing I could do in a Sorvath diplomatic context was to be completely, unreservedly settled about what I was saying at the level of physiology rather than performance. This is harder than it sounds. It is perhaps the hardest professional skill I have ever developed. It requires not the performance of confidence, which the Sorvath can read, I believe, even if they can't articulate what they're reading, but actual confidence, actual settledness, actual comfort with the position you are taking and the outcome you expect to reach. You have to genuinely not be afraid of the result. I worked at this for 31 years. I got pretty good at it. Miso started there. Miso's asleep on the desk chair. At 06:15, I went to the diplomatic wing's main conference room to check the setup. It is a larger room than mine, built to seat 12 comfortably, or 20, in the configuration they use when they want everyone to feel slightly compressed and therefore motivated to reach agreement. The station facilities team had set it for 10, 5 seats on each side of the long table, with the head seat at the northern end designated by the placement of its water carafe and its slightly more elevated profile relative to the others, as the seat of highest status. I set my materials at the seat to the left of the head position. Translation consultants do not sit at the head. This is a rule the Bureau has never formally articulated, but has never needed to. The spatial grammar of these rooms is legible to everyone who has spent time in them. I went back to my room to collect my notes and my coffee. Miso was not on the desk chair. I looked around the room. He was not on the bed, the windowsill, the secondary chair, or the floor beside the coffee station. The door to the corridor was closed. I checked the bathroom. I checked under the bed. I checked the narrow gap between the wardrobe and the wall, which is a space he has previously found appealing in stations with similar proportions. He was not there. I stood in the middle of the room for a moment. Then I went back to the conference room. He was in the head chair. He had, at some point between 2200 and 0630, opened the door to my room. He does this. The lever-style handle requires a specific application of weight and paw pressure that he has known since he was 8 months old. Walked down the corridor to the conference room, which I had not fully latched when I left it, and installed himself in the head seat with the calm, settled permanence of a senior official who arrived early to establish precedent. He was sitting up straight, the way Maine Coons do when they are comfortable and confident. Chest out, tail curled around his feet, face forward, eyes at their typical half-lidded level of serene and utterly unimpressed observation. The water carafe was beside him. He was not touching it. He did not need to. He was simply there, in the way that a mountain is simply there. I stood in the doorway. He looked at me. I looked at him. "No," I said. He slow blinked. "That is not an agreement. That is a Maine Coon's equivalent of a polite acknowledgement that you have spoken. It means, I have heard you. It does not mean, I will comply." I crossed the room and reached for him. He tolerated this in the way he tolerates most things, with a measured, dignified patience that communicates, without aggression or alarm, that he is allowing this to happen as a courtesy and reserves the right to have a different opinion at any time. He is 12.5 kilograms. Moving him when he has decided not to be moved is not a violent process. It is a structural one. It requires specific placement of hands and a lifting motion that he observes with the air of a person watching a mildly interesting maneuver that doesn't particularly affect him. I lifted him. He was warm and very solid. I carried him back to my room and set him on the bed. "Stay," I said. He looked at me. He looked at the door. He did not move immediately. I took this as a small victory and did not examine it too closely. At 0650, the Sorvath Delegation arrived. I had last seen Counselor Vorth 8 years ago, and time had done approximately what I had expected. He is tall for a Sorvath, 2.5 meters, with the characteristic shoulder width that makes their formal delegation robes necessary, rather than ceremonial. His facial coloring had deepened from the rust orange of his middle years to the darker copper red that indicates seniority in his sublineage. He moved as high-status Sorvath always move. Not quickly, not slowly, but with a complete absence of the small adjustments and accommodations that lower-status individuals make when navigating a room full of people. The space rearranged itself around him. He didn't rearrange himself around the space. He had 6 delegates with him, not 7 as I had been briefed. Someone had revised the manifest and not told me. I noted this. It didn't change my approach, but it's the kind of thing you note. Commander Omandi met them at the conference room entrance. She made the correct formal greeting. Bureau Standard, Sorvath Diplomatic Register. The specific vowel elongation that marks the greeting as coming from an acknowledged peer, rather than a subordinate. She had been coached well. I saw Vorth's yield red recalibrate slightly, not dramatically, but enough to be legible to someone who knew what they were watching. Then he walked into the conference room, moved to the head of the table, and stopped. Miso was in the head chair. He had, at some point in the 11 minutes between my placing him on the bed and the delegation's arrival, reopened the door to my room, walked back down the corridor, re-entered the conference room, and resumed his position in the head seat with an air of unbroken continuity, as though he had never left. He was sitting in exactly the same posture as before, chest out, tail curled, face forward, eyes at half-mast, focused somewhere in the middle distance, with the serene, fully settled attention of a creature who is, on a metabolic level, the most comfortable thing in the room. The 6 Sorvath delegates stopped. Vorth stood at the head of the table and looked at Miso. Miso looked at nothing in particular, in the specific way that high-confidence animals look at nothing in particular. Not because there's nothing to see, but because everything that can be seen has been assessed and found unremarkable. One of Vorth's aides, a younger delegate, copper orange rather than deep red, which put him in his 20s by their developmental calendar, stepped forward. His role, as I understood it, was protocol management. He reached for Miso. Miso turned his head and looked at him. He looked at him with the full, calm, unhurried attention of 11 kilograms of glacier-descended predator deciding whether a thing is relevant. He did not hiss. He did not tense. He did not do anything except look at the aide with the direct, unconcealed, pressure-free gaze of a creature that does not experience the concept of threat because the concept has never been applicable. The aide stopped. He stopped the way you stop when you step off a curb and find, unexpectedly, that you are a single step higher than you thought. Not a dramatic stop, not a frightened stop. A stop produced by some part of the nervous system that processes a signal faster than the conscious mind can form a reason. He looked back at Vorth. Vorth had not moved. He was still looking at Miso. A second aide stepped forward. This one was more senior, darker coloring, confident posture, the movement pattern of someone accustomed to being the person who handles things. He reached toward the chair. Miso slow blinked. The aide's hand paused. I have seen this happen before. I have never been able to fully explain it, and I spent several years trying. There is something about a slow blink from a large, calm, visibly apex confident animal that produces a very specific output in species that process eye contact as a dominant signal. The slow blink is not a concession. It is not an appeasement. It is the blink of something that has decided you are not a threat and is communicating this fact with the same basic energy as a judge closing a case file. The matter is settled. There is no further business. The aide's hand withdrew. He had not been instructed to withdraw it. He had not made a decision exactly. He looked briefly confused by his own arm. I was sitting at my designated seat, 2 positions down from the head, with my translation notes in front of me and my coffee in my right hand, watching this happen. I did not intervene. I want to be precise about this for the record. I did not intervene because there was no reason to intervene. Miso was not behaving badly. He was sitting in a chair. He was looking at things. He was, if anything, behaving with more composure than anyone else in the room, which is a thing I could say about him in most rooms and most situations, and which would be accurate most of the time. Vorath said something in Sorvath. I will not reproduce the exact phrase because it uses a register of high formal Sorvath that does not translate cleanly, but the closest English approximation is something between what manner of being and by what standing is this placed. It is a phrase used when one encounters something that does not fit the existing hierarchy mapping and requires categorical reclassification before the social processing can continue. He was asking what Miso was. Commander Omandi looked at me. He is my accompanying personnel, I said, in the formal Sorvath diplomatic register. He has bureau identification. There was a silence. Vorath looked at Miso. Miso continued to look at nothing in particular, with the focused, settled quality of a thing that has been doing this for a very long time and expects to continue doing it for the foreseeable future. He does not, Vorath began, and then stopped. He stopped because Miso had turned and looked at him. Not with aggression. Not with any expression that could be called threatening by any framework I am aware of, Sorvath or otherwise. He looked at Vorath with the calm, direct, complete attention of a Maine Coon who has decided that the tall, copper-red individual at the end of the table is tentatively the most relevant thing in the room and deserves to be observed accordingly. Vorath's yield read processing, and I am speculating here, but I am speculating based on 31 years of close study, encountered a problem. The problem was this: Miso was not yielding. Not in any of the ways the Sorvath social processing framework was designed to detect. He was not making the small postural accommodations of a lower-ranked individual in the presence of a higher-ranked one. He was not directing his gaze away or down. He was not adjusting his position to appear less central or less authoritative. He was not doing any of the things that the yield index registers as low status. He was, from the Sorvath social processing framework's point of view, simply present, fully, calmly, without qualification present, in the head chair, in the room without concern. This is the signal that registers, in Sorvath processing, as the highest available status level, because high-status individuals do not yield. They are simply present. They do not accommodate. The room accommodates them. Everything that cannot yield is, by the operational logic of the system, at the top. And Miso, who cannot yield because yielding is not a concept he has ever needed, because he is a cat, and he has been comfortable in every room he has ever entered, and the idea of adjusting himself in response to someone else's status signals is about as available to him as the idea of photosynthesis. Miso was registering in Vorath's involuntary social processing as something for which the Sorvath framework did not have an adequate category, something that did not yield to the counselor of the second delegation, who had not met anything that did not yield to him in 14 years of active diplomatic service. Vorath sat down, not at the head of the table, at the seat to the right of the head, the seat that, in Sorvath spatial grammar, is designated for the individual of second highest status in the room. He sat down with the careful, deliberate movement of someone acting on instinct and reasoning through it, simultaneously, which is an uncomfortable combination and which produces, In high-status Sorvath, the specific facial expression I was looking at. Not quite discomfort, not quite recognition, but the cognitive state that occurs when a deeply automatic process produces an output that the conscious mind is still in the process of evaluating. His 6 delegates, after a moment, sat down around the table. The session had not formally opened. No one had said anything that counted as the beginning. Miso cleaned his left paw. I opened the session at 07:03, 3 minutes late, which I attributed to transit logistics, which was not entirely false. I did not acknowledge Miso's position. I did not explain it. I set my notes on the table, and I began with the standard translation of the opening framework statement, which I have delivered so many times that the words sit in my mouth like old furniture, familiar to the point of invisibility. The session proceeded. This is the part that is difficult to describe to people who haven't spent time in Sorvath diplomatic processes, because what happened in the following 4 hours does not look dramatic from the outside. There were no raised voices. There were no theatrical moments. There was no point at which I could say, "There, that was it. That was the thing." The first hour was ground clearing. Sorvath's delegation laid out the structural map of their position. The clauses they considered settled, the clauses they considered open, and the 3 contested amendments, which they did not raise directly but which their framing left visible, the way you can see the shape of something under a cloth. I translated everything precisely in the appropriate registers, without editorial addition. Commander Omandi and her 2 senior advisors received the translations, made notes, asked clarifying questions. Sorvath's yield rate during this first hour was recalibrating steadily. I can't know this for certain. I know it because of what I observed in his posture and his attention direction. A Sorvath delegate who has read the room as low status doesn't watch the human side closely during the ground clearing hour. There's nothing to watch. The information he's already processed tells him the outcome is extractable, and the only question is how much. A Sorvath delegate who is recalibrating watches everything. Sorvath watched everything. He watched me deliver the translations without any of the small accommodating tics that mark a lower yield individual. No softening before a difficult clause, no pacing adjustment, no apologetic register drop when delivering a position the other side wasn't expecting. He watched Commander Omandi receive the translations and respond with the compressed direct delivery style of someone who had been, I now understood, specifically coached to project settled authority rather than collegial flexibility. Someone had taken my advice in the pre-session briefing better than I had expected. He watched Miso. Miso, in the window corner loaf position, was doing nothing. He was occupying space in the full, complete unreserved way that large, confident animals occupy space, not spread out, not taking up more room than he needed, but present with a density that some animals have and others don't. The density that comes from never having spent a moment wondering if the space was yours to take. The second hour was substantive. Both sides worked through the settled clauses, confirming agreed language, flagging points for final legal review. This is the hour in a treaty session that looks like paperwork from the outside, but is actually the most information-rich part of the process, because how both sides handle the settled clauses tells you everything about the contested ones. Do they confirm quickly or slowly? Do they introduce small new modifications to previously agreed language? Which signals uncertainty about whether the agreement will hold? Do they ask clarifying questions that are actually retractions in thin disguise? Sorvath's delegation moved through the settled clauses at an even, deliberate pace. No new modifications, no thin disguise retractions. They were a professional delegation doing professional work, and I had always known they were. The 6 weeks of positional hold behavior was a negotiating approach, not incompetence. I noted Sorvath's third glance at Miso in the second hour, then stopped counting. At the recess at 09:30, I poured a second coffee, and Miso descended from the window ledge and walked the room's perimeter. He does this sometimes. He will conduct a thorough spatial inspection of any room he has been in for more than 2 hours, covering all 4 walls in sequence, pausing at the corners, noting what has changed since the last inspection. He is not looking for threats. He is, I think, simply maintaining his map, updating the inventory of known space. He walked past Vorath's chair. He did not look at Vorath. He was looking at the wall, the corner, the floor surface, the structural quality of the room. He walked past the chair at a distance of approximately 30 centimeters, with the unhurried, floor-level attention of an animal conducting its own internal audit. Vorath did not move. I have seen many things not move in the presence of a large, confident animal. Prey animals freeze. Flight animals go very still before the decision point. But what Vorath did was different. It was not the stillness of an animal measuring whether to run. It was the stillness of something that had received a signal it was trying to process. A signal that said, "This is a being that has moved through this room and found it adequate. This room and everything in it." The recess ended. We returned to the table. What happened was this. Vorath's yield signal processing kept returning to Miso, not because Miso did anything in particular. He sat in the head chair for the first 40 minutes and then relocated, on his own schedule and without announcement, to the corner of the table nearest the window, where he sat in a compact loaf and observed the session with the mild, uninvested attention of a creature attending a long meeting that has nothing to do with him. He yawned once, extensively, in the second hour. He groomed his tail for approximately 8 minutes during a recess at 09:30. At one point, he descended from the table, walked the full perimeter of the room with the deliberate, measured pace of an inspection, and returned to his spot without incident. Each time Vorath's gaze moved to him, and it did repeatedly in the involuntary pattern of a social processing system checking a status input it hasn't been able to file correctly. Miso was simply there, calm, settled. The same temperature the room would have been without a crisis. The 3 contested amendments came up at 09:52, which was earlier than the Bureau's negotiating timeline had projected. Vorath raised them as a block, which was his standard approach. Present all 3 together, frame them as interconnected. Wait for the human side to begin disassembling them one by one, which signals uncertainty and invites further pressure. Commander Omandi looked at me. I had anticipated this. I had prepared a response in the high formal Sorvath register that addressed all 3 amendments from a position of calm, full settled authority. The register that signals in Sorvath linguistic grammar that the speaker is not in the process of negotiating, but is communicating a determination. Not aggressive, not argumentative. Simply, this is how it is. I delivered it. Then I looked at my coffee. Vorath was quiet for a moment. His yield processing was, I suspected, currently conducting an inventory. The woman at the table had spoken in the highest register formal Sorvath, from a position of demonstrated competence, without a single yield signal in her delivery or her posture. The animal in the corner, the one that had been in the head chair, the one that his aide had reached for and stopped short of, the one that had looked at him with the specific quality of gaze that his entire social architecture reads as foundational status. The animal had turned its head at the sound of her voice and was now watching her with the focused, interested attention of something tracking a sound it associates with positive outcomes. There is a specific Sorvath social processing concept for the relationship between a high-status individual and the being to which that individual is meaningfully attached. I am simplifying here, but the operational output of that concept is, if the highest status thing in the room orients toward you with positive attentiveness, your status is calibrated upward, not to the same level, but adjacently, significantly upward. Miso was looking at me because I had spoken, and he associates my voice with things like feeding time and the specific quality of attention I give him when I'm working and he wants company. He was not thinking about Sorvath social grammar. He was a cat, and I had spoken, and he was therefore watching me with the calm interest of an animal whose person has done something worth noting. Vorath withdrew all 3 amendments at 10:17, not one at a time, all 3 as a block. The way you remove a positional hold when you have recalculated the status landscape of a room and determined that the yield pressure strategy is no longer the correct operational approach. He did not explain his reasoning. Sorvath delegates of his seniority do not explain their reasoning in session. The withdrawal was delivered in 2 sentences, in the high formal register, without qualification. Commander Omandi, to her considerable credit, received this without visible surprise, said 3 words in the appropriate Sorvath response register, and moved on to the next agenda item. I wrote 2 words in the margin of my notes, clean withdrawal. Under them, I wrote 4 minutes from my delivery to his response. Then I crossed that out, because I had been wrong about the timeline. I went back through my memory of the session and recounted. It had been 25 minutes from Vorath's arrival at the conference room to my delivery of the formal response. In those 25 minutes, his yield processing had taken in. Miso in the head chair, the failed removal attempts by his aides, the slow blink, the relocation to the window seat, the perimeter inspection, and the specific quality of calm, full settled presence that his neural architecture reads as the foundational status signal. By the time I delivered the response, the room status mapping had already been redrawn. The 4 minutes was not the work. The 4 minutes was the administration of a conclusion that had already been reached. The session concluded at 13:40, 11 hours and 17 minutes before the Sorvath deadline clock expired. The treaty framework was initialed. The contested amendments were gone. Miso was asleep on the window ledge. I filed my post-session notes that evening, ate dinner in the station's civilian dining area, and began packing. I had a transit back to Earth in 36 hours and no reason to extend the posting. Commander Amandi found me in my room at 2000. She stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. She is not a person who wastes words, which is one of the things I had come to appreciate about her in the course of a working day. 12 years, she said finally. 12 years of Sorvath negotiations across this cluster, and no one has managed a clean withdrawal on all 3 amendments in a single session. The framework was sound, I said. The Bureau's team had done solid work. She looked at me. I looked at my packing. He was in the head chair for 40 minutes, she said. He often sits in chairs, I said. He finds them comfortable. My protocol officer told me he watched Vorath's aide reach for the cat twice. Twice the aide stopped without being told to. It happens, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Miso was on the bed, cleaning the base of his tail with the focused efficiency of a professional. Is there a briefing note I should be preparing? She asked. Something for the Bureau? That's above my pay grade, I said. I'm a translation consultant. I translate, Dr. OB Commander. The cat, she said, with the careful precision of someone choosing each word before releasing it. The cat did that, or contributed to that, in a documented, 6-witness, formally logged treaty session. And I should just what? Write it up as satisfactory conclusion reached, and note that the accompanying personnel were well behaved? I looked at Miso. He had finished cleaning his tail and was now sitting in the position he takes when he has decided that the immediate tasks are complete and the remainder of the evening is available for whatever presents itself. Upright, loose, the tail curved against the bed sheet, the eyes at their characteristic half-lidded equanimity. You can write whatever you think is accurate, I said. For my own purposes, I'll note that I delivered the formal response in the appropriate register at the appropriate moment, that the Sorvath Delegation conducted themselves professionally, and that all parties reached a satisfactory conclusion within the allotted window, and the cat. And Miso attended, as is his right under Bureau ID number VT247992C, in his official capacity as accompanying personnel. She stared at me for a long moment. His official capacity, she repeated. It's in the file, I said. She left. I don't know what she wrote in her post-session report. I imagine she found a form of words that covered the outcome without requiring her to explain the mechanism to a committee. I have been doing that for 31 years. It is not dishonesty. It is an understanding, earned slowly and at some cost, of which truths are useful to communicate and in what form, and which truths are better served by allowing the results to speak for themselves. The results in this case were a clean treaty conclusion, 11 hours early, with 3 contested amendments gone and no hard feelings on either side. Sorvath's delegation departed Station Karev Null at 1500 with the formal courtesies intact and the yield index correctly calibrated. Everyone had, from their own perspective, behaved appropriately. This is the best outcome a diplomatic session can produce. I have been in sessions that ended with the same treaty clauses, the same formal courtesies, and weeks of residual tension that required 3 follow-up consultations to dissipate. Clean conclusions are rare and worth preserving. I packed slowly, with the particular unhurried quality that packing takes on when you've been somewhere briefly, but not trivially, when the work was real and the room has acquired the kind of ordinary familiarity that makes leaving it a small, quiet act. I folded the 2 cardigans I always bring to stations because the climate control is never quite right. I collected Miso's travel food from the corner shelf, and his water bowl from beside the coffee station, and his secondary blanket from the desk chair, where it had been less useful than intended, because the desk chair's primary occupant had been him. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while. Miso climbed up beside me and sat with his shoulder against my hip, which is a thing he does. Not asking for anything, just there. I thought about Kofi, the way I think about him in quiet moments. Not with the sharp, disabling grief of the first year, but with the steady, worn smooth quality of a thing that has been carried long enough to fit the hand. He would have enjoyed today. He would have asked careful, precise questions about the yield index, about the specific moment when Sorvath recalibrated, about what I thought Miso was experiencing during the perimeter walk. Whether there was something in him that registered the quality of the room the way his social processing hypothesis had always suggested. I didn't know the answers. I still don't. But I thought about what Kofi had said, that Miso had never once conflated his own presence with the question of whether that presence was welcome. And I thought about what 31 years of diplomatic work teaches you about the difference between performing confidence and being confident. And I thought that there is a version of the treaty session today that I could explain entirely in terms of social processing frameworks and yield, index scores, and the specific register choices I made in delivering the formal response. And there is a version that is simply, the cat sat in the chair, the room recalibrated. We went home. Both versions are accurate. Neither one is more true than the other. There is a thing I should tell you about Miso, and I have been telling this story long enough now to say it plainly. He is not doing anything. I want to be clear about that. He is not performing a function. He is not strategically deploying his presence. He is not, in any sense that could be attributed to intention, helping me do my job. He is a cat. He sits in chairs because chairs are comfortable. He looks at things because he is curious, and because looking is one of the few activities available to him that does not require more effort than he is usually willing to expend. He does not yield to Sorvath counselors because he does not know what a Sorvath counselor is, and if he did know, he would not find this information useful. He is simply himself at full volume, without modification. I have been in 11 Sorvath cluster sessions in the past 8 years, 3 with Miso. The 3 with Miso produced faster, cleaner resolutions than any of the 8 without. I noticed this after the second one. I am a professional. I notice patterns, but I want to be honest about what the pattern is and what it isn't. It isn't magic. It isn't strategy. It is, as best as I have been able to reconstruct it, using the Sorvath social processing framework I have spent 30 years studying, the specific effect of an animal that cannot yield, encountering a species whose neural architecture processes non-yielding as the highest available status signal. It is a measurement device. Miso does not affect the Sorvath. He reveals to them something about the room that was already true. expressed through the only language their social processing reads automatically. He reveals that I do not yield either, not because I learned it from him, though he has been a useful teacher in other respects, because I spent 3 decades learning exactly how calm you have to be in a room full of people who are trying to determine your rank, and that number is completely calm, not performing calm, not adopting calm as a strategy. Completely calm in the actual physiological sense, in the way that you are calm when you know what you are doing, and you have done it 1,000 times, and the outcome is a technical problem, not a personal one. Miso is calm the way I have learned to be calm, except he has never had to learn it. He was born that way. He has never experienced his own presence as anything less than adequate. He has never walked into a room and wondered whether the room would decide he belonged there. I have had to earn that. He just has it. There is something in that which I find useful to think about on long transit days, when there is nothing to do but read and watch the stars go past. I should say something about the 3 contested amendments, for anyone who wants to understand what was actually at stake in that room. Amendment 1 concerned navigation corridor access in the 3rd ring approach lanes around the cluster's secondary trade hub. The Sorvath position, held for 6 weeks, was that human shipping manifests required pre-clearance at a Sorvath checkpoint 48 hours in advance. The Bureau's position was 24 hours. This is not, on the face of it, a large difference. In practice, it adds a 24-hour operational constraint on every human commercial transit through that corridor, which, extrapolated over the projected treaty term, represents somewhere between 12 and 18% of total transit efficiency for the companies operating in that route cluster. The Bureau had calculated this. The Sorvath Delegation had calculated this. Everyone in that room knew exactly what the number meant. Amendment 2 was a mutual inspection clause in the Environmental Containment Protocol for the 4 jointly administered processing stations along the cluster boundary. The contested language concerned the advance notification period for joint inspections. 60 days in the Bureau's version, 90 days in the Sorvath version. A 30-day difference, the practical effect of those 30 days, for a species that treats advance notification as a status signal is considerable. A 60-day notice says, "We trust you enough to give you 2 months." A 90-day notice says, "We assume you will need 3 months to prepare," which implies an assumption about your baseline compliance levels that is functionally insulting in high register Sorvath diplomatic grammar, even if the Sorvath negotiating team was genuinely unaware of that reading. I had flagged this in my pre-session notes to the Bureau. I do not know whether anyone read my pre-session notes. Amendment 3 was a clause about the structure of future dispute resolution panels. Specifically, the language used to determine whether a given dispute would be heard before a neutral arbiter or before a joint panel composed of both parties' representatives. The Sorvath version included a provision that would have given their delegation slightly more control over the classification of disputes. In isolation, it is a minor clause. In the context of a treaty that would govern commercial relations for 30 years, it is the kind of minor clause that becomes the load-bearing wall in every significant disagreement for 3 decades. None of these amendments had been withdrawn in 6 weeks of negotiation. They were withdrawn, all 3, on the morning of the day the Maine Coon attended the session. I am not arguing causation. I am noting the timeline. The Bureau's statisticians can do what they like with it. On my last morning on Station Karev Null, I ate breakfast in the civilian dining area and then walked Miso through the diplomatic wing for what I had started calling, privately, the final inspection. He does this at the end of every posting. I do not know why. He walks the spaces we have occupied with the methodical, thorough attention of someone confirming that everything is as it should be before departure. He checks corners. He examines surfaces. He sits for a moment in each space that had been at any point his and then moves on. He went to the conference room. The door was open. He went in, walked the perimeter, and sat for a moment at the corner of the table where he had spent most of the session day before. The spot by the window, the loaf position, the half-lidded observation stance. He sat there for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he got up, walked out, and came back to my side in the corridor. I do not know what he makes of these places. I do not know what, if anything, registers for him as significant or memorable. He is a cat. His interior life is his own. I know what I make of them. I have been in a lot of rooms in 31 years. Most of them have been rooms where someone was waiting to find out how much weight my presence would carry, and whether they could push back, and whether I would accommodate or hold. The rooms where I have done my best work are the rooms where the answer to that question was settled before I opened my mouth, not because I was aggressive, not because I was performing authority, because I was simply there, in the way that you are there when you know what you are doing, and you have been doing it long enough that the knowing has become something closer to bone. Miso is there the way I have learned to be there. He just started earlier. We left Station Karev Null at 1400 on a commercial transit. He rode in his carrier with the mesh panel open, looking at the other passengers with the same calm clinical interest as always. 2 rows back, a young Sorvath traveler, not a diplomat, from the casual attire, possibly a student or a junior researcher, noticed him and went very still. Miso turned and looked at the Sorvath traveler, with the direct, unhurried attention he gives to everything. The Sorvath traveler looked at me. I lifted my coffee. He turned back to his book. Miso looked at the stars. The Bureau sent a follow-up inquiry 3 weeks after the session, which I answered in 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph covered the translation work and the formal conclusion. The second paragraph covered Miso's status as accompanying personnel, cited his ID number, and noted that he had behaved within all applicable parameters for Bureau-registered dependents throughout the posting. I appended his current veterinary clearance certificate, which was valid through the following April, as a courtesy. I did not receive a reply. I took this to mean the file had been closed. The treaty framework came into effect 4 months later. Navigation access in the 3rd ring corridors ran on a 24-hour pre-clearance schedule. The inspection clauses used 60-day language. The dispute resolution panels were structured according to the Bureau's preferred formulation. I read the official announcement on a Tuesday morning, eating breakfast in my garden, with the vegetable beds at my left, and the Sorvath problem at the far end, and Miso on the wall to my right, sitting in the position he takes when the morning light is good, and the temperature is exactly what he prefers, and everything is, by his assessment, as it should be. The Sorvath problem was no better when I got home from the posting, but it had not been worse either, and Miso, on the first day of our return, had conducted the garden perimeter inspection with the focused, methodical attention he gives to any space that has been unwatched, and the Sorvaths had receded to the far corner of the vegetable beds, which is not a resolution, but is an arrangement I can live with. He does not chase them. He has never chased them. He walks past them. In the specific way he walks past everything, with full awareness and zero urgency, and they move. Something in the quality of his movement, perhaps, something that reads even to a Sorvath as, "I have already catalogued you. You are noted. I have found you unworthy of more than this passing acknowledgement." This is, I have come to understand, a form of power. Not the power you demonstrate by acting, but the power you carry by being. The kind that does not need to announce itself. I have spent 31 years trying to cultivate that quality in myself, in the specific, high-stakes context of interstellar diplomatic sessions with species who will read any crack in it as an invitation. I have gotten better. I have not gotten there. Miso has always been there. He slept in my reading chair that evening. He has a bed, a good one, with a memory foam cushion and a removable washable cover. He prefers the reading chair. He has always preferred the reading chair. I have stopped arguing about it. The Bureau called again in the spring. Something in the Karev sector, new delegation, contested clauses, hard deadline, the usual. I said yes. I confirmed Miso's transit documentation was current. We packed on a Tuesday.